Imagine winning a bloody, truly unimaginable war for your freedom. You have your rights literally written into the highest law of the land, the Constitution.
Right.
You're voting. You're electing people from your own community to Congress. And then a few decades later, you find yourself legally re-enslaved in everything but name.
Yeah. Stripped of the vote and trapped in a system of terror.
Exactly. How does a democracy pull off that kind of vanishing act?
It is, well, it's one of the most unsettling questions in American history. And it really challenges that core myth that progress is just this natural upward curve.
It really does. So welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're answering a very specific and honestly massive request from you, the listener.
Which is a great question, by the way.
It is. You asked when the Civil War ended, was slavery completely over? What actually happened in the history of the United States from the end of the Civil War all the way through to the Voting Rights Act a century later?
Yeah, that's a lot of ground to cover.
Right. So we're taking a magnifying glass to the era of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow laws, those grueling legal battles like Brown v. Board, and the grassroots mass movements in places like Montgomery and Selma.
And to do this impartially, we're relying on an incredibly comprehensive, deeply researched historical manuscript titled From Emancipation to the Voting Rights Act, Black Life, Power, Dispossession, and Democratic Struggle in the United States, 1865 to 1965.
Wow, that is quite the title.
It is, but it's essential material. And we are not just going to recite a dry timeline of legislation here.
No, definitely not.
This deep dive is about the lived experiences of individuals. It's an exploration of the economics, the vicious politics, the societal shifts, and the cultural views of a pivotal century. Just reporting what the source material lays out.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to set up the starting line. It's April 1865, Appomattox.
Right, the surrender.
Yeah. The Confederate Army surrenders. The Civil War is effectively over. 4 million human beings are suddenly freed from a system that didn't just steal their labor, but, claim their kinship, their physical movement, their very legal identity.
It's hard to even fathom.
Right. But I'm trying to wrap my head around this. If you are one of those 4 million people, what does freedom actually look like on a Tuesday morning when you wake up and there is absolutely no blueprint for what comes next?
Well, that is the essential, terrifying, and frankly, exhilarating reality of 1865. Emancipation was not a single, clean legal event where someone just flipped a switch.
Like, boom, you're free now.
Exactly. It was a messy, incredibly uneven military and administrative reality. In some places, Union troops arrived and read the Emancipation Proclamation aloud.
Right.
But in others, enslavers deliberately hid the news from their captives for months.
Wow, just pretended it didn't happen.
Yeah. But what is truly profound in the source material is the realization that the formerly enslaved people didn't need a seminar in political philosophy to define what freedom meant. They possessed what the text calls negative knowledge.
Negative knowledge. I want to make sure I'm getting this. That means you know exactly what something is because you are intimately, painfully familiar with its exact opposite.
Precisely. They knew what freedom meant because they knew precisely in their bones what slavery had denied them.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Right. If slavery meant your children could be sold away at an auction block, then freedom meant family reunification. We see this massive explosion of mobility immediately after the war.
Like people just packing up and leaving.
Yeah, people walking hundreds of miles, placing desperate advertisements in newspapers, just trying to find a sister or a husband who had been sold to a different state a decade earlier.
Man, that physical movement alone must have been revolutionary. Just the act of walking down a road without a pass from a white man.
It was huge. Freedom also meant the right to worship without a white supervisor monitoring your prayers. It meant the right to build your own churches, to learn to read.
Because reading was literally illegal before.
Exactly. And crucially, from an economic standpoint, freedom meant the right to withdraw women and children from gang labor in the fields.
Gang labor, meaning working under an overseer.
Yeah, under slavery, the entire family was forced to work the cash crops under the whip. So freedom meant trying to establish a family economy where perhaps the children could go to a rudimentary school and the wife could work in their own home rather than the planter's field.
But hold on, we have to look at the other side of this equation too. The former slaveholders. They just lost a war that completely devastated their infrastructure.
Absolutely devastated.
Their currency is worthless, and their entire economic model, which made them some of the wealthiest people on the planet, was based on having a captive, unpaid workforce.
Right.
What is their mindset in the summer of 1865?
Their mindset is sheer panic. mixed with a deep, furious entitlement. This is the first great truth of the post-war South, according to the text. Emancipation abolished slavery, but it did absolutely nothing to abolish the planters' desire to command labor.
They still wanted the free work.
Of course, they accepted legal abolition reluctantly, mostly because they had a gun to their heads, but they desperately needed to save the plantation economy. To do that, they needed a post-slavery order that preserved the total discipline of slavery without the formal title of ownership.
I'm trying to think of how to picture this. It's like, imagine you finally break a terrible, abusive lease on an apartment.
Okay.
The law steps in, says you don't live there anymore, you are free, you don't owe that landlord anything. But the landlord still holds the deeds to every other building in town. He owns the grocery store, he controls the local police, and he essentially forces you to clean his building for free if you want to survive.
That is a very apt mechanical analogy.
The words on the legal paperwork changed, but the actual physical power dynamic didn't budge.
Yeah. And the Southern legislatures didn't just rely on informal power. They immediately moved to formalize that new dynamic through what were called the Black Codes.
I've heard of those. What were they exactly?
These were a series of laws enacted in late 1865 and 1866, and their explicit design was to criminalize Black independence.
How did those actually work on the ground, like practically speaking?
Through intense, targeted regulation. For instance, many states passed severe vagrancy laws.
Vagrancy, like being homeless.
Yeah, basically being unemployed. If you were a newly freed Black man walking to town to look for a better paying job and you didn't currently have employment, a local sheriff could declare you a vagrant.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You'd be arrested, fined an amount you couldn't possibly pay, and then your labor would be auctioned off to a local planter, often the exact same person who used to enslave you to pay off the fine.
So it's a legal trapdoor right back into forced labor.
Completely. There were also apprenticeship statutes that allowed white local authorities to seize Black children and bind them to white employers.
Wait, they could just take people's kids.
Yes, again, often their former enslavers. They did this under the guise that the parents were unfit or too poor to care for them. They also forbade Black people from renting land outside of incorporated towns.
That's incredibly restrictive.
And they required special, expensive licenses if a Black person wanted to be an artisan or a mechanic, which essentially forced them back into agricultural labor.
They just rebranded the coercion. The ambition to control the physical body and the labor of Black people was identical to slavery.
It really was. And this raises an important question. How would the federal government respond to this brazen attempt to undo the results of the Civil War?
Because remember, the Union had just sacrificed over 300,000 soldiers to defeat the Confederacy.
Exactly. What were they going to do about the peace? And the massive complication here is the man sitting in the Oval Office.
Andrew Johnson. No, wait, I'm confused here. I learned in school that Johnson was Lincoln's vice president.
He was.
He was a Union guy. The North just bled 500,000 men to win this war. Why on earth would he just hand the keys right back to the Confederates the second Lincoln is assassinated?
It's a crucial point of confusion for a lot of people. Andrew Johnson was a war Democrat from Tennessee. Lincoln put him on the ticket in 1864 as a symbol of national unity.
Ah, okay. A unity ticket.
Right. Johnson opposed secession because he despised the wealthy Southern aristocrats who broke up the country. He was fiercely pro-union. But, and this is the vital distinction, he had absolutely zero sympathy for Black equality.
So he didn't care about civil rights at all?
Not even a little. The sources show he held deeply, profoundly racist assumptions about Black incapacity.
So he didn't care about remaking Southern society. He just wanted the Southern states back in the fold under his control.
Exactly. Johnson imagined a rapid restoration of the Southern states under white leadership. Emancipation would technically stand, but political power would be handed right back to the same people who started the war.
That must have been infuriating for the North.
Oh, it was. He issued thousands of pardons to former Confederate leaders. His leniency was the green light the South needed. It absolutely emboldened them to pass those Black codes.
And I imagine the violence didn't just stop with the war.
It didn't. The violence that accompanied this horrific pogroms and massacres of Black citizens in Memphis and New Orleans in 1866 made it impossible for the North to ignore. The South wasn't just passing bad laws. They were murdering Black people in the streets to enforce them.
Which triggers a massive constitutional crisis. Congress looks at Johnson, looks at the South, and basically says, absolutely not. We did not fight this war for this. And we see the radical Republicans take the wheel.
Yes. The Republican-controlled Congress realizes Johnson is actively subverting the outcome of the war. So they shift gears into what we call radical Reconstruction.
Okay, so what's their first move?
They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and when Johnson vetoes it,
He actually vetoed it.
he did. But Congress overrides his veto. The first time in American history, Congress overrode a president's veto on major legislation.
Wow. What did that act actually do? Because to a modern listener, civil rights usually makes us think of the 1960s.
Right. But the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is one of the most foundational laws in our history. It declared that all persons born in the United States, with the exception of Native Americans, who were treated as separate nations at the time, were citizens.
Okay.
And it guaranteed those citizens basic civil rights regardless of race. This was a direct, devastating repudiation of the infamous Dred Scott decision from 1857, which had explicitly claimed that black people, free or enslaved, could never be citizens of the United States.
Okay, so the 1866 Act guarantees the right to make contracts, to sue, to give evidence in court, to own property. But I have to push back here.
Sure, go ahead.
If these laws were passed in Washington, if the paper says you are a citizen with rights, why didn't things actually get better for you down in rural Georgia or Mississippi?
Because rights on a piece of paper in Washington require local enforcement on the ground. You can have a federal law that says you have the right to negotiate a fair labor contract. But what does that actually mean when you walk into the courthouse? The local sheriff, the local judge, the local jury are overwhelmingly white, and they are entirely sympathetic to the planters.
So the system was rigged at the local level.
Completely. A
Right.
legal right to contract means absolutely nothing when the landlord controls all the arable land, the local merchant controls all the credit, the state criminalizes you for being unemployed, and armed white vigilantes are riding around at night enforcing total deference.
It's just a terrifying reality.
Formal legal equality is entirely hollow if you do not have substantive material power to back it up.
There is a massive canyon between the law in D.C. and the lived reality in a southern county. And the Republicans in Congress realize this, right?
They do.
They realize a simple statute isn't enough, because what happens when the Democrats win back Congress in 5 years?
Yeah.
They could just repeal the Civil Rights Act.
Exactly. So they decide to constitutionalize it. They embed these rights into the bedrock of the nation. They draft and pass the 14th Amendment, which guarantees birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law.
And then the 15th, right?
Yes. Then they pass the 15th Amendment, which prohibits states from denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
And this kicks off the era of radical Reconstruction, which, again, we often misunderstand. Reconstruction wasn't about rebuilding burned bridges or fixing railroad tracks.
Not at all.
It was a complete constitutional revolution.
It was an attempt at a forced democratization of the South. Congress divided the South into military districts commanded by Union generals. They required Southern states to write entirely new state constitutions.
They really didn't mess around.
No, they didn't.
Yeah.
They demanded black male suffrage as a non-negotiable condition for these states to be readmitted to the Union. And because of that federal military protection, because the U.S. Army was literally standing there guarding the ballot box, you see an absolute explosion of black political participation.
It's truly staggering when you look at the numbers. Within a few years, men who had literally been held as property, who had been whipped for trying to learn the alphabet, were now entering the institutions that made the laws.
Yeah, it's a dramatic shift.
You have black men serving in local offices, sitting as sheriffs, serving in state legislatures, and even entering the United States Congress. Guys like Hiram Rebels from Mississippi becoming a U.S. senator.
And they actually built an incredible amount of infrastructure.
They did. The biracial Reconstruction governments were remarkably progressive for their time, weren't they?
Very progressive.
Yeah.
They established the very first modern public school systems in much of the South. Prior to this, public education in the South was practically non-existent. If you were wealthy, you hired a tutor.
That was it. Just tutors.
Pretty much. But Reconstruction governments built hospitals, penal institutions, and asylums. They modernized the state.
There is such a deep irony there. The southern states that would later spend a century boasting about their proud traditions and railing against federal overreach actually receive their most modern, foundational public institutions like mass public schooling from the very biracial Reconstruction governments they violently despised.
It is a profound historical irony. But as the source material meticulously details, this era of democratic promise does not last.
No, it doesn't.
And the seeds of its destruction were sown very early on. specifically regarding the battle for land.
We have to talk about 40 acres and a mule. It's a phrase everyone knows, but very few people know where it comes from or how it failed.
Right. It originated from General William Tecumseh Sherman's Special Field Order Number 15 in early 1865. As his army marched through Georgia, thousands of emancipated people followed him.
That makes sense, seeking protection.
Yeah, but it created a logistical crisis. To deal with it, he confiscated hundreds of thousands of acres of plantation land along the coast and divided it into 40-acre plots for the freed families.
So for a brief moment, it looked like the federal government was going to fundamentally redistribute the wealth of the South.
Yes, but then Andrew Johnson takes over.
Ah, of course, Johnson.
Yes. Johnson orders the military to evict the freed people from this land and return it to the pardoned Confederate planters.
Unbelievable.
That failure to redistribute land is the Achilles heel of the entire Reconstruction era. In the minds of the freed people, freedom naturally implied access to the soil they had cleared, planted, and harvested for generations without a dime of pay.
Because land is power.
Exactly. If you have land, tools, and credit, you have economic independence, you can feed your family, you can walk away from a bad employer. If you have none of those things, you are economically trapped.
Which forces the newly freed people into the system of sharecropping and tenant farming. Now, when you hear sharecropping today, you probably just picture poor farmers working hard.
Right, a very sanitized view.
But we need to look at it as a deliberate legal trap. Let's really break down the mechanics of it. How did this system actually function?
Sharecropping emerged out of a standoff. The planters wanted gang labor, basically slavery, with a tiny wage paid at the end of the year.
And the free people weren't going for that.
Completely rejected it. They wanted family autonomy in their own land. Sharecropping was the gritty compromise. A black family would agree to work a specific parcel of a white planter's land.
Okay, makes sense so far.
In return, at the end of the harvest, the family would receive a share of the crop, usually half, while the planter kept the other half as rent.
On paper, that sounds, okay. You work hard, you get half the profit.
On paper, yes. In principle, it gave the family some control over their daily lives. The planters wasn't out there with a whip every hour.
Right.
But in practice, the mechanics of the system turned it into a nightmare of cyclical debt peonage. And the mechanism for that was the cropline system.
Right, because you can't just farm with nothing. You need seeds, you need plows, you need food to survive until the harvest comes in. And where do you get that?
You get it from the furnishing merchant, who's very often the landlord himself.
Oh, wow. Double dipping.
Oh, absolutely. The merchant would advance the family's supplies, flour, bacon, seeds, tools on credit. But the interest rates on this credit were astonishingly high, sometimes 50, 60, or 70%.
That's just loan sharking.
It was. And the collateral for this loan was a legal lien on the future crop.
So I want to use an analogy here. It's like a company town. Your boss pays your wages, but he also owns the only grocery store in town, and he issues you a company credit card.
Spot on.
And the prices at the store are jacked up, the interest rate on the card is exorbitant, and by the time payday rolls around, he does the math and tells you that your paycheck doesn't even cover your grocery bill. You actually owe him money.
That is exactly how the math worked. And crucially, the landlords dictated what was grown. They didn't want the sharecroppers growing food like corn or vegetables to feed themselves because food doesn't pay off the debt.
Right, they wanted cash crops.
They demanded cotton. This tied the sharecroppers to a highly volatile global cotton market. If the harvest was bad, or if the global price of cotton dropped, the debt deepened.
And the sharecroppers weren't allowed to see the ledgers. Wrong.
Usually not. Add in widespread illiteracy, deliberate, fraudulent bookkeeping by the landlords, the infamous 2 sets of books, and the result was predictable.
Just a rigged game from the start.
At the end of the year, the landlord weighs the cotton, sets the price, tallies the exorbitant debt at the company store, and tells the farmer, "You came up short, you owe me." And under the law, you could not leave the land if you owed a debt.
It's a perfectly designed closed loop of exploitation. But let's say you somehow managed to navigate that impossible math. Let's say you were incredibly thrifty, the harvest was great, and you saved enough to try and buy your own small plot of land. What happens then?
Then you face the extra legal violence. This is where organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and the Knights of the White Camellia come in.
Right, the terror groups.
And the manuscript makes a very crucial analytical point here. We tend to think of the Klan purely as a hate group driven by blind racial prejudice. But during Reconstruction, it was highly strategic.
It wasn't just random violence, it was a paramilitary tool.
Precisely. They were the terrorist wing of the Democratic Party and the planter class, designed for political and labor control.
Labor control, really.
Yes. I mean, yes, they assassinated black political organizers and white Republicans to suppress the vote, but they also systematically attacked school teachers, ministers, prosperous black land renters, and any black person whose conduct implied economic independence.
So if you bought land, you were a target.
Because if a black laborer bought land or demanded fair pay, it challenged the core unspoken assumption of white mastery. Violence was the blunt instrument used to maintain that mastery when the law no longer allowed for literal slavery.
It was labor union busting, voter suppression, and racial terror all rolled into one.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? If you zoom out, the massive takeaway is that you cannot have lasting political equality without altering the underlying distribution of material wealth.
That's the core tragedy.
The federal government gave black men the vote, but left them economically dependent on the very people who wanted to strip that vote away, and eventually the Reconstruction experiment collapses. But it didn't just slowly fade away because people got bored of it, did it?
Not at all. It was violently overthrown. The term overthrown is essential. The organized campaign of terror in the South made maintaining biracial democracy incredibly costly.
For the Norse, you mean?
Yes, for the North. And at the same time, the North began to lose its resolve. A severe economic depression, the Panic of 1873, shifted national attention to labor strikes and poverty in northern cities.
So they got distracted.
Northern white voters grew fatigued with the constant military intervention in the South.
They just got tired of hearing about it.
They did. They increasingly preferred sectional reconciliation with white Southerners over continued conflict to protect black
They
Southerners.
just abandoned them.
This northern retreat culminated in the Compromise of 1877, following the heavily disputed presidential election of Rutherford B. Hayes. To secure the presidency, Republicans agreed to a backroom deal to formally withdraw the remaining federal troops from the South.
So the shield is gone. The federal troops pack up their camps and march away. And almost overnight, the biracial democratic experiment is dismantled. The white conservative governments sweep back into power in every southern state.
And they called this process redemption, which brings us to the architecture of Jim Crow.
Let's talk about that word, redemption.
It is such a revealing, religiously loaded term. It implies that Reconstruction was a dark period of captivity from which the civilized white South had to be saved.
That framing is just wild.
And what these redeemers built next, the Jim Crow system, was not an accidental drift. It wasn't just a set of bad manners or personal prejudices. It was a deliberate, highly engineered regional regime of domination.
And their primary problem is that they have power back, but they still have the 14th and 15th Amendments staring them in the face.
Right.
The federal Constitution says they cannot deny the right to vote based on race. They can't just pass a law saying black people can't vote. So how do they get around the highest law in the land?
What's fascinating here is how power learned to speak bureaucratically. They couldn't use explicit racial language in the law, so they got immensely creative.
Bureaucratic racism.
Exactly.
Mm.
During the 1890s and early 1900s, starting with Mississippi, southern states held conventions to rewrite their constitutions. They adopted a suite of ostensibly colorblind voting requirements.
Like what?
Things like poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding clauses, and grandfather clauses.
On paper, to a northern judge or a modern reader, a literacy test just looks like a standard procedural rule you should be able to read to vote.
Exactly. But in practice, the administration of these laws was completely arbitrary. The white registrars applied them entirely to eliminate black voting power.
How bad was it?
Well, a black college graduate might be asked to translate a complex passage of the state constitution in Latin, or answer absurd questions like how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, and then be deemed illiterate.
While a white farmer who couldn't spell his own name was allowed to vote.
Through the escape hatches they built into the laws. The most famous was the grandfather clause, which stated that if your grandfather had the right to vote before 1867, meaning before black men were enfranchised, you were exempt from the literacy test and the poll tax.
Unbelievable. Just a perfectly designed bureaucratic sieve.
It was. It let poor, illiterate whites slip through to the ballot box while systematically catching and turning away perfectly literate, property-owning black citizens.
Wow.
Within a decade, black voting registration in states like Louisiana dropped from over 130,000 to just over
But
11,000.
it is just a staggering drop.
It was a stunning surgical removal of democratic rights.
They hid the racism behind the paperwork, and then the Supreme Court steps in and essentially gives it their constitutional blessing. We have to talk about Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896.
Oh, yes.
This is the case that stamps the phrase separate but equal into the American legal framework.
The Plessy case involved a man named Homer Plessy who intentionally challenged a Louisiana law requiring segregated train cars. He was arrested, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The court ruled 8-1 that as long as the separate facilities were equal, segregation did not violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause.
But the text is so clear on this point. Segregation was never, ever about mutual comfort. It wasn't just, hey, we'll sit over here, you sit over there, and we'll both have a nice train ride.
Never. The phrase separate but equal was one of the most intellectually dishonest formulas in the history of American jurisprudence.
Because it wasn't equal.
The separation was fiercely, violently real. The equality was a total fiction. The black train cars were often half-baggage cars, filthy, and lacked basic amenities. But more deeply, segregation in transportation, schools, water fountains, and civic spaces was about visible, daily subordination.
It was psychological warfare.
Yes. It physically announced every single day in every public interaction who belonged to the ruling class and who belonged to the servile class. It was a constant rehearsal of racial hierarchy.
And if you stepped out of line, if you forgot your place in that hierarchy, the terror was waiting. Which brings us to a figure we absolutely have to highlight, Ida B. Wells.
Yes, an incredible figure.
She was a pioneering investigative journalist who looked at the horror of lynching and proved that the accepted national narrative was a complete fabricated lie.
The prevailing white narrative at the time, which, by the way, was repeated in northern newspapers and even by some progressive politicians, was that lynching was a harsh, regrettable, but necessary form of vigilantism to protect white women from assault by black men.
Which was completely false.
Entirely. Ida B. Wells, who was based in Memphis, shattered that myth with devastating clarity, empirical data, and raw courage.
She actually went out and investigated the lynchings, right? She didn't just opine from a desk.
She did. And she proved, case by case, that the vast majority of lynching victims were never even accused of assault. Instead, she showed that lynching was a public technology of rule used to punish economic success, labor organizing, and political dissent.
So it was about money and power again.
Always. For example, her close friends in Memphis owned a successful grocery store that competed with a white-owned store. They were lynched because their economic competence threatened white dominance. Lynching dramatized the fatal consequences of black autonomy.
And what was the response to her publishing this truth? A white mob burned down her newspaper office, the Memphis Free Speech, and threatened to murder her if she ever returned to the city.
But she didn't stop.
No, she just took her campaign national and international. She is an absolute titan of American history. But the deep dive also points out that the violence wasn't just extra-legal mobs in the woods. The legal system itself was weaponized through something called convict leasing.
This is one of the darkest chapters of the era. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted.
That is a massive, gaping loophole.
And southern state governments ruthlessly exploited it. They passed pig laws, which upgraded petty theft, like stealing a farm animal worth $10, to grand larceny, punishable by years in state prison.
Wow. $10.
Through vagrancy charges, petty offenses, and intensely racially targeted policing, black men were swept into a burgeoning criminal justice system. But the states didn't build large penitentiaries to house them.
They didn't.
No, instead, they leased these prisoners out to private companies, to U.S. Steel, to coal mines in Alabama, to railroad camps, and to massive cotton plantations.
So the state arrests you on a bogus charge and then rents your body to a corporation for profit.
Exactly. And the conditions in these labor camps were often deadlier than antebellum slavery. An enslaver had a financial investment in keeping an enslaved person alive because they were property.
Right, they had to protect their asset.
But a coal mining corporation leasing a convict had no such incentive. If a prisoner was worked to death in the mines, the company simply requested another one from the state. The mortality rates were staggering. It was emancipation and re-enslavement coexisting simultaneously through altered legal forms.
And where is the rest of the country during all of this? The North won the war. Why are they just looking away while the South reinstates a caste system?
The North and South reconciled by deliberately rewriting the memory of the Civil War. By the 1890s and early 1900s, the national culture shifted toward celebrating the mutual bravery of white soldiers on both sides.
They turned the Civil War into a tragic, romantic family quarrel between brothers, rather than a profound revolution over human bondage and constitutional rights.
They chose sectional reconciliation over racial justice. Memory became policy by other means.
How so?
Well, if the country remembers the war merely as a tragedy of brother against brother and romanticizes the lost cause of the South, then undoing Reconstruction looks like restoring natural order rather than enacting a vicious racial reaction.
It gave the North an out.
Exactly. It gave the North the moral permission it wanted to abandon Black Americans to the Jim Crow system.
But here is where we need to pivot sharply, because it is so vitally important for you, the listener, to know that Black history during this horrific era is not just a catalog of suffering and victimization.
Right. That's a very incomplete picture.
If we only look at the laws and the lynchings, we miss the actual people. This is a profound story of agency, of institution building, and of thriving under the shadow of Jim Crow.
That is a critical point. If we only focus on the mechanics of oppression, we inadvertently reproduce the old racist fantasy that Black Americans were merely passive objects acted upon by white supremacy.
Which is completely false.
The reality of Black life under Jim Crow is a testament to extraordinary adaptation, collective strategy, and internal resilience.
Let's look at the institutions they built, starting with the Black church. Because it wasn't just a place to go sing hymns on Sunday morning, it was the absolute epicenter of the community.
It was one of the very few institutions substantially controlled by Black communities themselves, free from direct white supervision. It provided spiritual authority and comfort, yes, but it also offered unmonitored communication.
A safe space.
Right. It was a place for leadership training, for pooling money, for mutual aid. Black ministers became default political spokesmen because they were largely economically independent from the white power structure. Their salaries were paid by their congregations.
And we have to highlight the women of the church who were so often under-recognized in formal histories.
They were the engine of church life.
Organizing the fundraising, teaching the youth, and sustaining the social networks that held the community together. And then there's the monumental struggle for education.
Yes.
Jim Crow, state governments deliberately starved Black public schools of funding. We're talking about situations where a state might spend $14 on a white student and 50 cents on a Black student.
The disparity was intentional.
So what did Black parents do? They didn't just accept it, they taxed themselves, they organized, they literally dug into their own incredibly meager pockets to fund education.
The hunger for education was staggering, precisely because literacy had been violently forbidden under slavery. Segregated public schooling was intended to confine Black children to subservience, to teach them just enough to be compliant manual laborers.
Just keeping them down.
But Black communities treated education as a collective, sacred investment in future citizenship. They partnered with Northern philanthropies, like the Julius Rosenwald Fund, to build thousands of Rosenwald schools across the rural South.
And the mechanics of that are amazing. The fund didn't just give them a school, the community had to match the grant.
Yes, Black farmers who barely had enough to eat would donate land, cut the timber themselves, and contribute their labor to build these schoolhouses.
That's incredible dedication.
And beyond primary schools, they built and sustained historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs. These institutions were crucial. They trained the teachers, the ministers, the doctors, the lawyers, and the professionals who'd become the indispensable independent backbone of the mid-century civil rights struggles.
And alongside education, the cultural explosion is breathtaking. Art as resistance. Spirituals, the blues, work songs, and eventually the birth of jazz. These weren't just genres of entertainment for a weekend dance.
No. Expressive culture was a vital way of carrying history and asserting humanity. When you are systematically denied a voice in the legislature, the courtroom, and the press, your music becomes your archives and your political expression.
That is a beautiful way to put it.
The blues, for instance, was a method of turning suffering into form, of improvising an identity, and speaking profound coded truths about life, labor, and movement under the immense pressure of a society that demanded your silence.
But within this vibrant, struggling community, there was a deep, intense strategic debate on how exactly to move forward and dismantle white supremacy.
A very famous debate.
The two most famous figures here are Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, often in high school history, this gets painted as a simple hero versus villain narrative, or a conservative versus radical binary.
That caricature is highly misleading. and does a disservice to both men. This was a complex, sophisticated debate about strategy under incredibly severe constraints.
So break down Washington's side first.
Booker T. Washington, who had been born into slavery in Virginia, became the head of the Tuskegee Institute. He emphasized industrial education, economic self-help, and tactical accommodation in public.
The Atlanta Compromise speech, right?
Exactly. In his famous 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech, he suggested that black and white Southerners could be as separate as the fingers in social matters, but united in economic progress.
So he was saying, let's focus on the money first.
He believed that building an undeniable economic foundation, owning farms, businesses, and mastering trades was the absolute prerequisite. He thought that if black people proved their economic indispensability, political and civil rights would eventually naturally follow.
And W.E.B. Du Bois looks at that strategy and strongly disagrees. Du Bois was born free in Massachusetts. He was the first black American to earn a Ph.D. from Harvard. What was his argument?
Du Bois insisted that Washington's strategy was a dangerous surrender. He argued that you cannot protect your economic gains if you do not have the right to vote or equal protection under the law.
So civil rights immediately.
Yes. Du Bois advocated for full civil and political rights immediately. He championed higher classical education, what he called developing the talented tenth of the race, and believed in direct vocal agitation against injustice, which led him to help found the NAACP.
What's so crucial to remember is that both men were confronting the exact same brutal structure, a society that demanded black labor, feared black equality, and violently punished any open challenge.
Exactly.
They weren't enemies of each other's ultimate goals. They just had fundamentally different theories on how to survive a hostage situation and eventually dismantle it.
Precisely. It was a debate over sequencing. Do you pursue economic independence first or political rights first? And by the early 20th century, forces much larger than Southern race relations began to reorganize the landscape for black America entirely.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We see the start of the Great Migration. From roughly the 1910s through the 1960s, millions of black Southerners make a monumental decision.
A historic movement.
They decide they've had enough of the sharecropping trap and the threat of the lynch mob, and they start moving. They pack up and head to the North, the Midwest, and the West Coast.
It is arguably the most important internal demographic transformation in American history. You had the devastation of the cotton crop by the boll weevil pushing people off the land, combined with the outbreak of World War I.
Which changed the labor market, right?
Drastically. It suddenly cut off European immigration and created a massive labor shortage in northern industrial factories.
But it wasn't easy to just up and leave, right? The Southern planters didn't want their cheap labor pool escaping.
Absolutely not. Southern sheriffs would literally arrest black people at train stations for the crime of trying to leave the state. They banned northern labor agents.
So how did they do it?
The migration was a logistical marvel of grassroots communication. The Chicago Defender, a widely read black newspaper, secretly distributed information about jobs and train schedules. Pullman porters smuggled the paper down south. Letters from those who made it north, containing cash and tales of freedom, were read aloud in Southern churches, sparking migration fever.
So they go on the trains, they arrive in Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, seeping industrial wages and a better life. But the text reveals a really harsh truth. Leaving the South did not mean leaving racism behind.
Far from it.
Racism was a deeply national, not merely a regional issue.
The migrants arrived in northern cities and found themselves systematically boxed in. The North didn't generally have explicit, legalized Jim Crow signs over water fountains. Instead, they practiced racism through geography and economics.
Explain how that worked. How do you segregate a city without a specific segregation law?
Through mechanisms like restrictive housing covenants, where property deeds legally forbade the sale of the house to anyone of African descent. And through redlining.
Redlining, meaning the literal map.
Yes, where the federal government and private banks literally drew red lines on city maps around black neighborhoods, declaring them hazardous and refusing to issue mortgages or business loans there.
Wow.
They were also locked out of many labor unions and faced horrific police abuse and periodic white mob violence when they tried to move into white neighborhoods. The South codified racial hierarchy explicitly in the law, but the North practiced it ruthlessly through municipal policy, real estate practices, and informal violence.
However, there is a massive political difference. In the South, they were disenfranchised, but in the North, their votes mattered.
Exactly. The sheer urban concentration of black migrants in northern cities created massive, localized political voting blocs. That leverage began to shift municipal politics, electing black city councilmen and judges.
And the culture, too.
Yes, It fostered incredible cultural explosions like the Harlem Renaissance, a flourishing of literature, art, race pride, and new political possibilities.
And then you have the profound impact of the World Wars. During World War II, the Black press launches this incredible movement called the Double V campaign.
Victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home.
Yes, the glaring hypocrisy of it all. How can the United States position itself as the arsenal of democracy, fighting a war against Nazi racial supremacy overseas, while simultaneously tolerating lynching, segregation, and racial supremacy at home?
It was an undeniable contradiction.
And the military service itself broadened the horizons for over 1 million Black veterans. They fought, they bled, they commanded motor pools and supply lines. When they came back to Mississippi or Georgia, they were not going to accept being told to step off the sidewalk for a white man.
They expected the full rights of citizenship upon return, and they became key leaders in the local chapters of the NAACP. You also see the economic landscape shifting during this period with the New Deal in the 1930s.
Now, the New Deal had its own issues with race, right?
It was deeply compromised by Southern Democrats in Congress. Crucial programs like Social Security and the Wagner Act deliberately excluded agricultural and domestic workers, which meant they excluded the vast majority of Black workers at the time.
But even with those exclusions, it changed the relationship between the citizen and the government, right?
It did. It expanded the federal government's role in economic life. Some New Deal relief programs did reach Black communities, and this caused a massive political realignment, shifting many Black voters in the North away from the party of Lincoln and toward the Democratic Party of Franklin Roosevelt.
And the unions were a big part of that, too.
Furthermore, you have the rise of industrial labor unions during this era, particularly the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO.
Why were the unions so important to the civil rights struggle?
Because the CIO, unlike the older craft unions, actively sought to organize Black and white workers together in the massive auto and steel plants.
Oh, that's a big shift.
Black workers and intellectuals clearly understood that civil rights, without economic power, without a living wage, and job security, would remain incredibly fragile. The alliance between labor rights and racial justice became central.
So all the pieces are coming together.
By the 1940s and 50s, the foundational architecture for the modern civil rights movement was firmly in place. Urban voting blocks, experienced veterans, a circulating national Black press, labor union alliances, and seasoned legal organizations.
I want to zoom in on those legal organizations, specifically the NAACP, because the way it's often taught, it seems like the civil rights movement just magically sprouted out of the ground in the 1950s when Rosa Parks sat down.
A very common misconception.
But the reality is that it was the result of decades of grueling, methodical, brilliant legal groundwork.
Yes. Figures like Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the dean of Howard University Law School, and his star student, Thurgood Marshall, spent decades building a jurisprudential pathway to dismantle Jim Crow.
Social engineers, I think he called them.
Exactly. Houston had a philosophy that a lawyer should be a social engineer. And their strategy was brilliant. Instead of just attacking segregation on purely moral grounds, which conservative Southern courts would easily dismiss, they attacked its practical, mathematical, and financial absurdity.
I picture it like playing a game of Jenga. Instead of trying to knock the whole massive tower of Jim Crow over at once, they found the one specific block near the bottom called graduate and professional schools, and they pulled it, making the financial math of the entire system collapse.
That is a perfect analogy. The NAACP filed a series of lawsuits in the 1930s and 40s cases like Missouri X-Trail, Gaines and later Sweat v. Painter in Texas. They proved that separate but equal was a mathematical impossibility.
Tell me about the Texas case.
In the Texas case, a Black man named Heman Sweat applied to the University of Texas Law School. The state hurriedly set up a law school for him in a basement with a few books, claiming it was equal.
And Thurgood Marshall goes into court and says, "Are you kidding me? You don't have the alumni network, the law review, the prestige."
Exactly. Marshall argued that equality in education isn't just about the physical bricks of the building, it's about the intangibles. The Supreme Court agreed.
Setting a huge precedent.
The precedent was set. If a state refused to admit a Black student to its only public law school, it had to build an entirely new, genuinely equal law school with equal faculty and libraries just for Black students.
Which they obviously couldn't afford to do.
The financial strain and logistical absurdity of trying to duplicate every single state institution exposed the constitutional weakness of segregation. The goal was to erode the legal credibility of the doctrine step by step, lawsuit by lawsuit.
Which culminates in the absolute watershed moment, the 1954 Supreme Court ruling, Brown v. Board of Education.
Yes, 1954.
The court finally unanimously declares that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. They bring in the famous doll tests by psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark, proving that segregation inflicted profound psychological damage on Black children.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to ask, why was public education the ultimate battlefield? Why did the NAACP focus there, and why did the white South defend it so viciously?
Why do you think that was?
Because schools are where a society forms its citizens. It is where economic opportunity is distributed, and crucially, where social hierarchy is rehearsed and normalized. Segregated schooling kept Black communities underfunded while socializing white children into an assumption of superiority. To integrate the schools was to threaten the social reproduction of segregation itself.
But the backlash is immense. A lot of people think Brown was passed and the schools integrated the next day, but the next year, in Brown II, the Supreme Court issues implementation guidelines saying desegregation should proceed with all deliberate speed.
A phrase so famously vague and contradictory that Southern states treated it as an open invitation for delay.
And they launched what they called massive resistance. Southern politicians signed the Southern Manifesto, vowing to defy the court.
Some states went to extreme lengths.
States literally closed their entire public school systems rather than integrate them. In Prince Edward County, Virginia, they locked the doors of the public schools for 5 years.
5 whole years.
They issued taxpayer-funded tuition grants for white children to attend private segregation academies, while Black children were left with no formal education at all.
They stalled, they litigated, they intimidated. Brown was a monumental psychological and legal victory. It broke the legal spine of the Plessy Doctrine. But it showed the stark limits of the courts.
The courts can't enforce the law themselves.
Right, the Supreme Court doesn't have an army to enforce its rulings. To actually dismantle the system on the ground, it was going to take mass action in the streets.
And that transition from the quiet decorum of the courtroom to mass direct action brings us to Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, Rosa Parks.
A pivotal moment.
Now, we have to correct a massive popular myth here. The story we are so often told is that Rosa Parks was just a tired seamstress with aching feet who one day, spontaneously, decided she didn't want to give up her seat on the bus to a white man.
That version completely domesticates the movement. It turns a highly calculated strategic political act into a story of simple moral innocence. Rosa Parks was a highly seasoned, deeply committed activist.
She had been working at this for a long time.
She had been the secretary of the local NAACP chapter for over a decade. She had investigated brutal sexual assaults against Black women. Just months before her arrest, she had attended a workshop on racial integration and civil disobedience at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee.
So she knew exactly what she was doing.
Absolutely. Her refusal to move was a tactical stand within a community network that was highly organized and prepared to respond.
And respond they did. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted for 381 days. Think about the physical and logistical toll of that, over a year of walking miles in the rain and the heat.
It's an astounding level of discipline.
The Women's Political Council, led by Joanne Robinson, mimeographed 35,000 handbills overnight to launch the boycott. They organized incredibly complex carpools, churches, buying station wagons, setting up dispatch systems, creating entirely alternative economic infrastructures just to avoid financing their own daily degradation on the city buses.
It proved the staggering power of disciplined, collective economic sacrifice.
And this is where a 26-year-old minister named Martin Luther King Jr. emerges onto the national stage.
Yes, but it is vital to recognize that King did not create the movement out of nothing. He entered a field that was already tilled by local organizers, many of them working-class women.
He was sort of elevated by the community.
He was, but King's intellectual and oratorical gifts were extraordinary. He provided the theological framing and the strategic imagination that the movement needed to scale up. He articulated nonviolence not just as a passive personal moral choice, but as a deeply aggressive confrontational political tactic.
It was designed to force a violent system to expose its brutality for the whole world to see.
Exactly. Segregation relied on the illusion of peace, on the quiet compliance of custom. Nonviolent direct action, putting bodies in the gears of the machine, forced the enforcers of Jim Crow to use their violence in the light of day.
Making it visible.
It brought the hidden brutality of the system to the surface, often in front of national television cameras. It exposed the stark, undeniable contradiction between America's stated democratic principles and its Southern practice.
And it wasn't just the adults and the ministers leading this. The youth took direct action to a whole new level of physical risk. In 1960, you have the Greensboro sit-ins.
The sit-ins changed everything.
4 black college students sit down at a whites-only Woolworth's lunch counter in North Carolina and politely ask for a cup of coffee. When refused, they stay there. Day after day, more students join them. They are willing to endure having food dumped on them, being beaten by white mobs, and being arrested. They completely rejected the NAACP's pace of slow, courtroom gradualism.
The sit-in movement spread like wildfire across the South. It led to the formation of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, guided by the brilliant organizer Ella Baker.
They were really the front line of the movement.
SNCC represented the shock troops of the movement. The Freedom Rides of 1961 are another profound example. Integrated groups of young people boarded interstate buses to test recent Supreme Court desegregation rulings.
And the response from the local authorities was sheer barbarism.
It was. In Alabama, one of their buses was firebombed by a white mob, and as the riders fled the burning bus, they were beaten with iron pipes while the local police deliberately stood down.
Just horrific violence.
But when national television broadcast those images of burning buses and bleeding students, it shifted national consciousness. It made it utterly impossible for the white moderate in the North to claim that Southern segregation was just a peaceful, quaint, regional tradition that should be left alone.
That momentum brings us to Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, a decisive confrontation known as Project C for Confrontation.
A major turning point.
You have King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference targeting what was arguably the most rigidly segregated city in America. The strategy was to fill the jails through economic boycotts of downtown stores and mass marches. And you have Public Safety Commissioner Bull Connor, who was perfectly cast as the villain.
He really was.
He unleashes police attack dogs and high-pressure fire hoses powerful enough to strip bark off a tree on demonstrators, including hundreds of children in the Children's Crusade.
Birmingham was an industrial, economically modern city, yet it was politically ferocious in its defense of white supremacy. It was the ultimate test of King's strategy of forcing a crisis, and it was while he was in prison there that King wrote the famous Letter from Birmingham Jail, scribbled in the margins of a smuggled newspaper.
Which is an absolute masterpiece of political literature. He directly addresses the local white clergymen, the white moderates, who are essentially saying, "We agree with your overall goal, but we hate your methods. You are causing tension. Just be patient and wait for the courts."
King's deeply profound argument is that time itself is neutral. It does not inevitably heal injustice. Power concedes nothing simply because the calendar advances.
Right, waiting doesn't fix it.
He argued that the tension in the streets wasn't created by the marchers. The marchers merely exposed the hidden tension that already existed. To prefer order over justice is merely a preference for maintaining an unjust status quo. It was a searing, unanswerable reply to nearly a century of delayed Reconstruction.
Later that exact same year, in August 1963, we see the March on Washington. And again, popular memory kind of sanitizes this event. It's remembered mainly for King's soaring "I Have a Dream" speech, this beautiful, harmonious moment of national uplift. But the manuscript points out the official full name of the event, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
That phrasing is essential. It inextricably linked economic inequality to racial hierarchy. The movement organizers, like A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, understood a fundamental truth. A legally desegregated lunch counter means very little if you do not have the wages to buy a hamburger.
The economic side of the coin?
The right to sit anywhere on the bus means little if you are systematically denied access to fair labor markets, unions, and decent housing. They were demanding a massive federal jobs program and an increase in the minimum wage alongside civil rights legislation.
The pressure mounts to an unbearable level. And after President Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson uses his formidable political skills to push the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress.
A monumental piece of legislation.
It officially dismantles legal public segregation. It outlaws discrimination in hotels, restaurants, and theaters. It targets employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It is a massive, crushing blow to the Jim Crow legal architecture. But there is still one central pillar standing.
Voting. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was historic, but it did not fundamentally solve the problem of disenfranchisement.
Because it didn't guarantee the ballot.
In the Deep South, black voter registration and participation were still violently obstructed by literacy tests, poll taxes, and sheer terror. And without the vote, local sheriffs, local judges, and local school boards remained completely insulated from black demands. They didn't have to listen to a community that couldn't vote them out of office.
This brings us to the climax of the era, the battle for the ballot. The summer of 1964, Freedom Summer. Hundreds of Northern college student activists descend on Mississippi to join local SNCC organizers.
A very dangerous campaign.
Their goal is to register black voters and build alternative freedom schools. And they face pure, unadulterated terror.
Mississippi represented the harshest, most unyielding concentration of the Jim Crow order. Almost immediately, 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, a black Mississippian, and Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, 2 white Jewish activists from New York, are kidnapped and murdered by local Klansmen with the active participation of the local police.
It's just a horrific tragedy.
Their disappearance captured international headlines, but it also highlighted a bitter, uncomfortable truth within the movement. National outrage and federal intervention often only reached a boiling point when white northern bodies like Goodman and Schwerner were subjected to the very violence that black Mississippians had endured in the dark for generations.
And out of that crucible of Mississippi, we see Fannie Lou Hamer step onto the national stage at the 1964 Democratic National Convention.
Her testimony was unforgettable.
She gives this unsparing, national and televised testimony about the brutal, near-fatal beatings she received in a jail cell, simply for attempting to register to vote. She asks the entire country, is this America? But despite all this moral pressure, the local power structures in the South still wouldn't yield on voting rights. So in early 1965, the movement targets Selma, Alabama.
Selma became the decisive theater. SNCC and SCLC organizers aimed to expose the violent absurdity of the voter registration process there. The campaign culminated on March 7, 1965, a day known to history as Bloody Sunday.
What happened on that bridge?
Peaceful marchers, led by John Lewis and Hosea Williams, attempted to march from Selma to Montgomery to demand voting rights. As they crossed the apex of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were confronted by a wall of Alabama state troopers and deputized postmen.
And the troopers just unleash hell. They charge into the peaceful crowd with clubs, bullwhips, tear gas, and men on horseback trampling people. And again, the crucial element is that the cameras are rolling.
The whole world was watching.
National television interrupts a broadcast of the movie Judgment at Nuremberg, a movie about Nazi war crimes, to show footage of American state troopers beating non-violent black citizens on an Alabama bridge. The whole country, the whole world, sees it.
The visual juxtaposition was devastating. The political pressure on President Lyndon B. Johnson became absolute. He realizes he has to act immediately. A week later, he goes on national television to address a joint session of Congress to press for sweeping, definitive voting rights legislation.
And he says something incredible.
And in a moment that stunned the civil rights leaders watching, the President of the United States actually adopts and invokes the movement's own anthem, saying to Congress and the nation, "And we shall overcome."
It's an incredible alignment, and the result is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, I want to get into the mechanics of this, because earlier we talked about how the 15th Amendment during Reconstruction gave black men the right to vote, but it failed because of a lack of enforcement. Why was the Voting Rights Act of 1965 so much more effective?
Because the drafters of the VRA learned from the failures of Reconstruction. They realized you cannot just state a grand constitutional principle and leave the enforcement up to hostile local authorities or case-by-case lawsuits that take years.
So what did they do differently?
The VRA built aggressive federal machinery. First, it actively suspended literacy tests and other discriminatory devices in targeted jurisdictions.
So no more asking how many bubbles are in a bar of soap.
Exactly. Second, if a local registrar refused to register black voters, the VRA authorized the federal government to send in its own federal examiners to physically bypass local officials and register voters themselves.
They just cut out the middleman entirely.
And crucially, it included pre-clearance under Section 5. This meant that any state or county with a proven history of voting discrimination had to get federal approval from the Department of Justice before they could make even the smallest change to their voting laws or district maps.
Meaning they couldn't just invent a new bureaucratic trick.
Right. The burden of proof was finally shifted from the disenfranchised citizen onto the discriminatory state. It was, in many ways, the delayed fulfillment of the promise of Reconstruction.
But there's a profound, deeply heartbreaking irony here that we have to acknowledge. The fact that the Voting Rights Act was absolutely necessary in 1965, the fact that people had to have their skulls fractured on a bridge to get it passed, is a devastating indictment of everything the nation failed to do in the 100 years since 1865.
Absolutely. The rights secured in 1964 and 1965 were fundamentally the exact same rights nominally granted by the 14th and 15th Amendments a century earlier. The country spent 100 years and countless lives navigating a detour of its own making.
So we have covered an immense, heavy amount of ground today, from the Ash of Appomattox to the bridge in Selma. And this isn't just a history lesson for you to memorize dates for a trivia night. It is the story of how American democracy was continuously, violently shaped and reshaped.
It really is.
It proves that freedom isn't some straight, inevitable line of progress that just happens on its own.
Yeah.
It was fought for in 1865. It was violently rolled back by the Jim Crow system. And it was fought for again a century later by communities who spent generations in the dark, building the resilience, the schools, the churches, the legal theories, and the strategies to finally strike back and win.
And that leads to a final concept from the manuscript's conclusion that I want to leave with you to mull over. The landmark laws passed in 1964 and 1965 successfully dismantled legal segregation. They removed the whites-only signs and secured the ballot box. But they did not dissolve the deeply entrenched wealth inequality. They did not end carceral abuse or residential redlining or the massive disparity in public school funding. The old questions survived in an altered, modern form.
That's a sobering thought.
So ask yourself, what is legal equality actually worth without material security? And what happens to a society when the law finally recognizes equal rights on paper, but the underlying economy and geography continue to silently reproduce disadvantage every single day?
We started this deep dive by talking about how history isn't a clean, precise timeline. It's a murky, broken, fiercely contested landscape. And looking at those profound questions, it is abundantly clear that the landscape is still shifting beneath our feet today. Thank you for joining us on this profound deep dive into the source material. We'll see you next time.